The night was beginning to fall over the small town. The Central Park, always bustling during the day, was now nearly deserted. A cold breeze blew softly, rustling the leaves of the trees and spreading the scent of withered flowers through the air. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, the statue of the Virgin Mary watched over the park's silence. Dr. Michael was walking slowly, heading home after another long shift at the hospital. His steps were slow, and his mind, filled with the day's cases, sought a moment of peace. That's when he heard it. Low at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the sound of sobbing. Dr. Michael stopped and looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. A few feet away, at the base of the statue, he saw a small figure kneeling. It was a boy, his face buried in his hands, crying uncontrollably. With a heavy heart, Dr. Michael approached slowly. The scene was unsettling. The boy seemed oblivious to the world around him, completely consumed by sadness. Dr. Michael crouched beside him, trying to keep his voice calm as he spoke. "Hey, kid, are you okay? What happened?" The boy didn't respond. His sobs continued, broken and desperate, as if he was trying to hold back something far bigger than he could handle. Dr. Michael reached out, gently touching the boy's shoulder, but the child only curled up tighter, pressing his face against the ground. "Come on," Dr. Michael said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm a doctor. Are you hurt? We can go to the hospital. They'll take care of you there." Still no answer. The doctor realized the situation was more serious than it seemed. The boy's pain was palpable, but what caused it remained a mystery. With no other option, Dr. Michael decided to act. He lifted the boy into his arms, who was too weak to resist, and walked toward the hospital. The child's weight was minimal, but the weight of what he carried in his heart was visible in every tear shed. Dr. Michael knew he needed to do more than just treat the boy's physical body. He would have to uncover what was tearing his soul apart. Upon arriving at the hospital, Dr. Michael took the boy directly to an examination room. The medical staff, initially confused, quickly began to assess the child. But there were no visible injuries, no signs that something physical was wrong. Yet the boy kept crying, not uttering a single word. "He hasn't stopped crying since I found him at the park," Dr. Michael explained, watching as the other doctors tried to comfort the boy with gentle words, without success. With each attempt to make contact, the boy seemed to withdraw further. His face, swollen and red from crying, was a living expression of anguish. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Maybe he just needs rest," suggested a nurse, trying to diffuse some of the growing tension in the room. "Let's give him some time and see if he calms down." However, Dr. Michael was not convinced. He often dealt with trauma cases, but something about this boy struck him differently. There was a depth to the child's pain that resonated with his own memories. He felt helpless, and this sense of powerlessness to alleviate the boy's suffering left him restless. After some time, with the boy now lying in a bed, Dr. Michael decided to stay in the room. He sat beside him, watching. The sobbing had lessened, but the boy still whimpered occasionally, as if lost in a sorrow too great for him to bear. As the hospital remained quiet, Dr. Michael wondered what could be behind such deep grief. He felt he needed to find out, not just as a doctor, but as someone who understood loss. The night wore on, and the feeling that something more serious was at play grew within him. Now that Samuel was lying there before him, Dr. Michael knew this wouldn't be just another ordinary night at work. There was something more at stake, and he had to be ready to face it. As the hospital clock marked the passing hours, Dr. Michael remained beside Samuel. The boy who, now asleep, still let out occasional sobs as though his pain wouldn't allow for complete rest. Sitting in the chair next to the bed, Dr. Michael let his mind wander to memories he had long tried to suppress. Years ago, when he was still a young medical student, Dr. Michael had faced a loss that changed his life forever. His mother, always his greatest supporter, had been diagnosed with a degenerative illness. He had watched her deteriorate day after day, until the final silence of death claimed her. At the time, he had believed his medical training would be enough to save her, But the harsh reality that not all suffering can be healed had hit him like a devastating blow. The grief had shaped who he had become. To protect himself, Dr. Michael had learned to emotionally distance himself from his patients, maintaining a cold professionalism he believed was necessary for his emotional survival. But here, sitting beside a boy who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, he felt his defenses begin to crumble. Samuel's crying wasn't just a child's pain. Dr. Michael recognized in his sobs an echo of his own repressed sorrow. In that moment, he knew he couldn't just treat the boy as another patient. Samuel needed something more, something beyond medicine and diagnoses. He needed someone who understood his pain. The soft sound of a deep sigh caught Dr. Michael's attention. Even in light sleep, Samuel was restless. The doctor watched him, and a familiar sadness washed over him. The memory of his mother's final night came back in full force. He remembered sitting by her side, powerless to stop the inevitable. The memory took him by surprise, and he felt a wave of emotions he had long suppressed. Somehow, this boy made him revisit a past he thought he had buried forever. Dr. Michael wondered if Samuel, too, had faced the loss of someone dear. Perhaps, without realizing it, their pains were connected, as if fate had placed the two on the same path to help each other heal their wounds. At dawn, Samuel's crying had ceased, but he remained silent, lost in his thoughts. When Dr. Michael entered the room in the morning, he noticed that the boy was awake, staring blankly at the wall, expressionless. "Good morning, Samuel," the doctor said softly, sitting beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Samuel didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained distant, as if he were trapped in something no one else could see. Dr. Michael took a deep breath, trying to find a way to reach the boy. He knew that forcing an answer wouldn't help, so he decided to wait. The silence between them was heavy, but Dr. Michael was willing to bear it. After a few minutes, Samuel finally spoke, his voice fragile, almost inaudible. "She's gone." Those 3 words carried the weight of immense grief. The doctor felt a tightness in his chest. He knew what Samuel meant, but he needed confirmation. "Who's gone, Samuel?" he asked cautiously, not wanting to pressure him. "My mom," the boy replied, his words breaking as new sobs surfaced. She died yesterday." Dr. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the pain of the boy. The pieces were falling into place. Samuel had lost his mother, and the desperation he had shown in the park and throughout the night now made complete sense. The boy was alone, with no one to comfort him, no adult to support him through such a devastating moment. "I'm so sorry, Samuel," Dr. Michael said sincerely. "Losing someone we love is an immeasurable pain, but you don't have to face it alone." Samuel, however, seemed inconsolable. He began to sob again, and Dr. Michael knew that no words could ease the boy's immediate pain. Instead, he stayed beside him, letting Samuel cry, without rushing to stop the process. At that moment, the doctor understood that Samuel's journey to healing would be long and arduous, but he was determined to be the support the boy needed. There was no easy cure for grief, but Dr. Michael promised himself that he wouldn't let Samuel face this loss without help. As the morning wore on and the hospital began to stir with activity, Dr. Michael realized that he, too, was slowly beginning to confront his own losses, in a way he had never allowed himself before. The past he had so long avoided was now standing before him in the form of Samuel, and there was no running from it. Samuel, still shaken, remained silent for a while longer after his revelation. Dr. Michael watched him with empathy, knowing there was much more behind the boy's grief. Determined to understand better what had led him to this state, he pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "You were at the park, Samuel?" In front of the statue of the Virgin Mary, Dr. Michael began, trying to speak gently. "Why did you go there?" Samuel averted his eyes, his expression contorted with pain. The silence that followed felt endless, but Dr. Michael knew it was important not to rush the boy. He waited patiently, until finally, in a weak voice, Samuel responded. "My mom, she asked me to go." Those words captured Dr. Michael's attention. There was more to that visit to the statue than he had imagined. Samuel, with tears welling up in his eyes again, continued. Before she, Samuel paused, struggling to hold back his tears but failing. Before she died, she asked me to go to the statue of the Virgin Mary and pray for her. It was her last request. Dr. Michael's breath grew heavier upon hearing this. He could feel the weight of Samuel's words, the weight of such a painful request from a mother who knew she was at death's door. The boy had gone to the park, following his mother's wishes, but in doing so, he had only found loneliness and despair at the foot of the statue. I prayed, Doctor, Samuel continued, his voice broken by sobs. But nothing changed. She still died. The silence that fell over the room was crushing. Dr. Michael felt a deep sorrow hearing Samuel's confession. The boy was carrying not only the weight of loss but also the guilt of believing that his prayer, his last act for his mother, had not been enough. He thought he had failed. Dr. Michael leaned closer to the boy, feeling Samuel's pain resonate within his own heart. Samuel, you did everything you could, he said, his voice low but firm. Your mother knew you loved her, and the fact that you went to pray for her shows how much you cared. But some things like death are beyond our control. Samuel, still crying, looked at Dr. Michael with eyes full of sadness and confusion. The boy was struggling to accept something that was difficult even for adults to understand. That love and devotion, no matter how deep, could not stop the inevitable departure of those we love. The weight of the revelation had fallen on Dr. Michael like an avalanche. Samuel's pain was now clear, and as the doctor reflected on the boy's words, he felt his own past return with unexpected force. I know what it feels like to think you could have done something more, Dr. Michael began, his eyes fixed on the floor. When I lost my mother, I was a young man who believed that medicine could save anyone. I thought that if I studied enough, worked hard enough, I could stop her from leaving. But I was wrong. Samuel, still crying, looked at Dr. Michael, surprised to hear these words. For the first time, the doctor was opening up to him, showing that he too understood that pain. Just like you, I did what I could. And just like you, I felt powerless. Dr. Michael continued, his voice trembling slightly. But one thing I learned, Samuel, is that the love we feel for those we've lost never goes away. It stays with us, even when they're no longer here. Samuel listened closely, his sobs quieting a bit. Dr. Michael moved closer, his eyes now meeting the boy's. Your mother knew you loved her, and that love won't disappear. Even though she's not here anymore, she will be with you in every prayer, in every memory. The pain you feel now is because you loved her so much, and that is a good thing. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Samuel, still deeply sad, seemed for the first time to find some comfort in the doctor's words. He wasn't ready to smile or stop crying yet, but there was something reassuring in knowing that he wasn't alone in his grief. Dr. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his own shoulders begin to ease. He realized that in helping Samuel, he was also starting to heal his own wounds. The connection between them was not just that of doctor and patient. It was a much deeper bond, formed through shared pain and a mutual understanding of what it means to lose someone. Sitting beside Samuel, Dr. Michael felt a kind of inner peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew that the boy's journey was only beginning, just as his own was. But for now, at least they were not alone. The emotional connection between Dr. Michael and Samuel continued to grow stronger. Throughout the day, the doctor stayed by the boy's side, offering the support he so desperately needed. But at the same time, Dr. Michael could feel something changing inside him. What had begun as an act of compassion for a patient had transformed into something personal, something that struck him deeply. As night fell again, the hospital was quieter. Most of the patients had been attended to, and the lights in the corridors were dimmed. Dr. Michael sat beside Samuel, who, after so many tears, seemed exhausted. The silence between them, once heavy, now carried a sense of mutual understanding. Suddenly, as if a dam had broken, Dr. Michael felt the tears come. Without warning, without control, they began to fall silently. He tried, for a moment, to hide his face from Samuel. But he knew he couldn't maintain his facade of strength any longer. Samuel, who had been lost in his own pain, noticed Dr. Michael's tears and turned to him, surprised. Seeing the doctor, someone he thought was invulnerable, cry brought a new understanding to the boy. He realized he wasn't the only one carrying an unbearable weight. "Why are you crying, doctor?" Samuel asked, his voice soft but filled with curiosity. Dr. Michael took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears, but failed. He looked at Samuel, knowing there was no longer a reason to hide the truth. "Because, Samuel, sometimes the pain is too much," he replied, his voice trembling. "No matter how strong we try to be, there are moments when we just can't hold it in. And that's okay." Samuel stayed silent for a moment, watching the doctor with a new perspective. He had never seen an adult admit weakness, let alone a doctor, someone who was supposed to be the rock in times of crisis. But somehow, seeing Dr. Michael cry made him feel less alone. "I'm so sorry about your mom," Dr. Michael said, wiping the tears away with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry you have to go through this, but you don't have to face this pain alone." Samuel, still shocked by Dr. Michael's vulnerability, felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he realized he didn't have to carry everything on his own. There were people around him who understood his pain, who were willing to help him bear the burden, just as he was learning to understand Dr. Michael's own weight. The doctor, on the other hand, was experiencing something new. The feeling of allowing himself to be vulnerable made him feel lighter, as if the emotional barriers he had built over the years were finally starting to fall away. He understood that sometimes the best way to help others was to first allow himself to feel. That moment, shared in silence and tears, connected them even further. It was no longer just a relationship between doctor and patient, but between two souls who, in different ways, needed to face their demons together. After what felt like an eternity of shared tears, silence settled once again between Dr. Michael and Samuel. This time, however, the silence didn't carry the weight of unbearable grief. It was a different kind of silence, one of understanding, as if words were no longer necessary. Dr. Michael looked at the boy and saw that something had changed in him as well. Samuel was calmer now, his eyes still swollen from crying, but his breathing had steadied. For the first time since finding him in the park, Dr. Michael felt that Samuel might eventually find a way to move forward. The two remained there, side by side, without any rush to speak or move. There was a kind of peace in that moment that neither of them seemed willing to disrupt. Dr. Michael remembered how he had always thought his work was solely about healing physical wounds. But now he understood that there was so much more involved in emotional healing. "Are you feeling a little better?" Dr. Michael asked, with a slight smile on his face, though still tired. Samuel looked at him and nodded slowly. There were still no words enough to describe everything he was feeling, but he knew that, somehow, he was starting to find strength again. "Thank you for staying with me," Samuel said, his voice still low but filled with sincerity. Dr. Michael smiled. He knew he hadn't solved everything, and that Samuel still had a long road ahead. But the simple fact that the boy was expressing gratitude was a sign that he was beginning to process what had happened. "You're not alone, Samuel. Whenever you need me, I'll be here," Dr. Michael replied, feeling that the words came from a genuine place within him. The silence returned, but this time it was comforting. Dr. Michael and Samuel had shared something that few people could understand: the raw pain of loss and the slow, yet possible, journey toward healing. The doctor knew it wouldn't be easy, and that there would still be days of sadness for Samuel, just as there would be for himself. But in that moment they had found a point of connection, something that would allow them to move forward, even if slowly. As the night progressed and the hospital grew even quieter, Dr. Michael realized that he wasn't just caring for Samuel, he was also caring for himself. This silence, this pause, was the first step for both of them to begin healing. The next morning brought with it the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the hospital windows, gently illuminating the room where Dr. Michael and Samuel had spent the night. The atmosphere was lighter now, though grief still lingered in the air. The comforting silence of the previous night seemed to be the first step for both of them in accepting their own pains. Dr. Michael entered the room with a calmer expression, carrying a tray with a simple breakfast for Samuel. The boy, still lying in bed, slowly opened his eyes as the doctor set the tray down beside him. "I brought you something to eat, Samuel. I know you're not very hungry, but it's important that you eat a little," Dr. Michael said softly, sitting down beside the bed. Samuel looked at the doctor, still feeling the weight of sadness in his chest, but now with a new sense of safety. He knew that Dr. Michael was there for him, and that made him feel a little less alone. The boy took a piece of bread, starting to eat slowly. There weren't many words exchanged, but Dr. Michael could see that, little by little, Samuel was beginning to pick himself up. The process was slow, and he knew there would be hard days ahead, but that small act of eating in silence already showed progress. "How are you feeling today?" Dr. Michael asked after a few minutes. Samuel shrugged, still with a melancholic expression, but he answered honestly, "It still hurts a lot, but I think I feel a little better." Dr. Michael nodded, fully understanding what the boy meant. He had gone through this same cycle of ups and downs after losing his own mother and knew that grief didn't disappear overnight. The doctor began to speak gently, not only to comfort Samuel but also to prepare the boy for what was to come. "You're going to have good days and bad days, Samuel. The pain will come and go, sometimes unpredictably. But the important thing is that you allow yourself to feel it. Don't try to suppress what's happening inside you. I'll be here to help you through it, as will others who care about you." Samuel looked at Dr. Michael, still absorbing his words. He wasn't sure what the future would be like without his mother, but he was beginning to accept that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. Still, knowing that he had someone by his side, someone who understood his pain, made everything a little more bearable. As the hospital returned to its daily routine, with patients being attended to and doctors moving through the halls, Dr. Michael began organizing Samuel's discharge. He knew the boy couldn't stay in the hospital forever, but he also wasn't ready to face reality alone. "We're going to figure a few things out for you today, Samuel. We need to see where you can go, who can help you, but I promise I'll keep checking in on you. Okay?" Dr. Michael said. Samuel nodded slowly. He still felt lost, but for the first time since his mother had passed, he didn't feel completely abandoned. In the hours that followed, Dr. Michael contacted the city's social services, looking for a solution for Samuel. The boy was still too young to face the world on his own, and the doctor knew he needed to ensure that Samuel would be taken in by someone who could provide a home, even if just temporarily. While they waited for a response, Dr. Michael made sure to spend every possible moment with Samuel, ensuring that the boy didn't feel abandoned. The bond they had built over the past hours had become a source of strength for both of them. The doctor no longer saw Samuel as just a patient. He cared deeply for the boy. When the social worker finally arrived at the hospital, Dr. Michael felt a mix of relief and worry. He knew this was the necessary next step, but he also feared for Samuel's future. The boy would need a lot of emotional support to heal, and Dr. Michael wanted to be present in that process somehow. "Samuel, they're going to help you find a safe place to stay," Dr. Michael explained, trying to sound confident. "But I want you to know that this doesn't mean you'll be alone. I'll be around. We can keep seeing each other whenever you need." Samuel looked at the doctor with eyes full of gratitude and sadness. He knew he had to leave, but the comfort of knowing that Dr. Michael wouldn't abandon him brought a small measure of peace amidst the storm of emotions still swirling inside him. "Thank you, doctor," Samuel said softly. I don't know what I would have done without you." Dr. Michael smiled, feeling the emotional weight of those words. He knew that, in a way, they had helped each other. The boy had made him confront his own traumas and emotions that he had avoided for so long. When the time came for Samuel to leave the hospital, Dr. Michael walked him to the door, watching as the social worker led the boy to the car. The doctor felt a tightness in his chest as he watched Samuel go, but he knew that this was just the beginning of the boy's healing journey. And, to his own surprise, Dr. Michael realized that he was at the start of a new beginning, too. The experience with Samuel had changed him, and he now understood that, to truly heal others, he first needed to heal himself. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with the memories of his mother, not as a wound that still hurt, but as a part of his story that he could now accept. Dr. Michael stood there for a few moments, watching the car disappear into the distance. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, both for himself and for Samuel. But now, they both had the tools they needed to move forward. Even amidst grief, there was hope.